The winter of 1979 had clamped down on the industrial town of Harmony, Michigan, with a cruel, unyielding grip. It wasn't merely cold, the air itself seemed brittle, sharp enough to cut, and the sky hung low in a bruised, unchanging gray, promising only more snow and deeper, bone-chilling cold. A fine, glittering frost coated every surface, turning the skeletal branches of the maples into delicate, frozen filigree. Smokestacks, once vibrant with the industry that had fueled countless homes and families for generations, now stood mostly silent, gaunt fingers against the bruised heavens, exhaling only thin, reluctant wisps of steam. Factories that had hummed with life for decades, their vast windows glowing with activity, were shedding workers like dead leaves from an autumn tree, and the chill of economic despair, far more biting than the outside air, seeped into every home, every hushed conversation on street corners, every quiet sigh over morning coffee. Inside their small, two-bedroom house on Willow Street, Alara felt that cold seep into her bones, a constant, unwelcome companion. It wasn't just the air, it was a pervasive dampness that clung to the walls and seemed to settle in her chest. She pulled her worn cardigan tighter around her, the wool thin and offering little comfort against the drafts that snaked under the front door with a faint, icy breath and whispered through the old window frames. Her breath plumed faintly in the dim living room light, a small, visible cloud of her own warmth escaping into the vast, cold space. The single lamp on the end table cast long, wavering shadows, making the room feel larger and emptier than it was. Michael, her husband, sat hunched over the kitchen table, his silhouette stark against the weak light filtering through the window. A half-empty mug of cooling coffee sat before him, a forgotten sentinel, its steam long gone. His gaze was fixed, unseeing, on the smudged want ads in the local paper, the Harmony Gazette, its pages crinkled from repeated handling. His shoulders, usually broad and confident, the kind that had carried Lily with ease and offered a solid comfort, seemed to carry an unbearable weight these days, slumped forward as if in physical pain. He'd been laid off from the auto plant 3 weeks ago, a casualty of the latest, brutal round of cuts, and the silence of his days at home was far louder than the clamor of the factory floor had ever been. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed down on every corner of the house, a constant reminder of their changed reality. From her bedroom, Lily, their 6-year-old daughter, coughed. It was a dry, rattling sound, small and fragile, that tore at Alara's heart with a sharp, familiar pang. Lily had been like this for days, a persistent tickle in her chest that the cherry-flavored medicine from the corner drugstore barely touched, offering only fleeting, restless sleep. Alara's hand instinctively went to her own chest, a silent, maternal gesture of shared discomfort. Alara moved quietly to the kitchen, her footsteps soft on the linoleum, a deliberate effort not to disturb the fragile stillness that surrounded Michael. She peered into the refrigerator, its ancient motor humming a low, mournful tune. Inside, the shelves echoed with emptiness. A carton of milk, half empty, stood beside a single, bruised apple, its skin already softening. A block of cheese, wrapped in faded wax paper, was nearly gone, just a sliver remaining. The starkness was a cruel contrast to the bounty of just a few months prior, when the crisper drawer had overflowed with fresh vegetables and the freezer held neatly packaged cuts of meat. The last of Michael's severance pay had evaporated faster than morning mist, swallowed by the relentless bills, the mortgage, the electricity, the increasingly exorbitant cost of heating oil. Every penny had been a futile attempt to stave off the inevitable. A crisp, official-looking envelope lay on the counter, its red, past due, stamp a stark, angry accusation against the pale Formica. The gas company. Alara picked it up, her fingers tracing the bold, unforgiving letters. The words inside were terse, unequivocal. If they didn't pay by the end of the week, they'd be cut off. The thought sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins, colder and more terrifying than the Michigan winter outside. How could they survive without heat? How could Lily get better, shivering in a cold house, her small lungs already struggling? The questions hammered at her, leaving no room for answers. Michael stirred then, pushing the newspaper away with a frustrated sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire town. The paper slid across the table, crinkling loudly in the quiet room. "Nothing," he mumbled, his voice rough, hoarse with disuse and despair. "Same old story. No experience necessary, apply within, but they just look at you like you're a ghost. Like you're already dead." He ran a hand through his dark, unruly hair, pushing it back from his forehead, a gesture of weary agitation. His eyes, usually so full of life and warmth, the kind that crinkled at the corners when he laughed, were now shadowed with a deep, weary despair that seemed to dim the very light in the room. He hadn't shaved in days, a stubble of dark hair accentuating the hollows beneath his cheekbones, making him look gaunt, unfamiliar. Alara wanted to offer comfort, to reach across the small table and take his hand, to tell him it would be okay, that they would find a way. But the words felt like a lie, a betrayal of the cold, hard truth staring them both down from every corner of their small, cold house. She swallowed the useless words, the taste of them bitter on her tongue. Instead, she walked to the small, chipped ceramic vase on the mantelpiece, a relic from her grandmother's kitchen, where they kept their emergency savings. It had always been more symbolic than substantial, a place for loose change, for the rare extra dollar. She upended it. A few coins clattered out onto the worn wood, a paltry sum that wouldn't even cover a day's groceries, let alone the gas bill. The sound was thin and hollow, like a final, mocking laugh. Her gaze then drifted to her left hand, to the simple gold band that had been on her finger for 10 years. It wasn't a flashy ring, just a plain, solid gold circle, smooth and worn from a decade of wear, but it was a symbol, a promise, a tangible link to the happiest day of her life, to a time when the future had seemed limitless and bright. It gleamed faintly in the dim light, catching the last, desperate remnants of the afternoon sun trying to penetrate the heavy clouds outside, a tiny, defiant spark in the encroaching gloom. A desperate, terrifying thought began to form, a whisper at first, insidious and unwelcome, then growing, insistent, into a roar in her mind, drowning out all other sound. Later that evening, the whisper became a scream. Panic began to claw at Alara's throat, a cold, sharp hand squeezing tighter with each ragged breath Lily took. She remembered the doctor's words from their last visit, just a week ago, a sterile echo in the too quiet house. Dr. Evans, a man whose kindness was perpetually at war with his exhaustion, had leaned forward, his voice low, when he'd prescribed the cough syrup that hadn't worked. "She needs warmth, Mrs. Miller. And good, nourishing food. Her immune system is down." He tapped a pen lightly on his pad, a gesture of quiet urgency. "Keep her warm, keep her fed, and keep an eye on that cough. It's a nasty bug going around." The words echoed now, not as advice, but as a grim prophecy, a stark indictment. They were failing their daughter, failing to provide the most basic necessities, the very things that could pull her back from the edge. Michael, defeated, had already fallen asleep on the sofa, fully clothed, the evening newspaper still draped over his chest like a shroud. The headline, something about rising inflation and factory closures, was half obscured by his heavy breathing. He looked utterly spent, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual, his jaw slack in sleep. His hand, calloused from years of work, hung limply off the armrest, almost touching the threadbare carpet. Alara watched him from the doorway of Lily's room, a complex knot of pity and resentment tightening in her stomach. He was trying, she knew he was, but his efforts felt like a sieve trying to hold water. She returned to Lily's bedside, the small lamp casting a weak glow. Alara sat on the edge of Lily's bed, the springs groaning faintly beneath her weight, and stroked her daughter's feverish brow. Lily whimpered softly, her sleep restless, her skin burning beneath Alara's palm. The gold band on Alara's left ring finger, a simple, unadorned circle, suddenly felt heavy, a burning weight, a tangible symbol of a life that was slipping through their grasp. The choice, stark and brutal, was beginning to solidify in her mind, pushing aside all other thoughts, leaving only a cold, hard resolve. The next morning, the air was even colder, a sharp, metallic bite that promised no reprieve, cutting through the thin walls of their small house. Alara watched Michael leave, bundled in his threadbare coat, its tweed worn smooth at the elbows, his shoulders hunched against the biting wind. He was heading out into the gray dawn to another fruitless search for work, to the unemployment office where the lines grew longer each day, to factories that had already posted "no vacancies" signs. He carried a lunch pail, its metal clanking softly, containing a single, stale sandwich wrapped in wax paper and a thermos of black coffee. He didn't look back as he pushed open the protesting front door, the wind snatching at his hair. He just walked, a weary, solitary figure disappearing into the gloom. Alara stood by the window, her breath fogging the pane, watching his retreating figure until he was swallowed by the turn in the street. A knot of dread, cold and hard, tightened in her stomach. She knew he was trying, saw the effort etched in his face, but hope was a dwindling resource in Harmony, a town slowly being choked by the economic downturn. She spent the morning making calls, the rotary phone dial clicking and whirring, each number a small act of faith. Her voice, initially steady, grew hoarse with each polite refusal. Her sister in Ohio, usually a source of boisterous cheer, sounded thin and tired, struggling with her own husband's unemployment. "Alara, I wish I could," she'd sighed, "but we're barely keeping our heads above water here. Billy's been out of work for 6 months now. The kids, well, they need shoes." Michael's parents, proud and distant, had barely enough to get by themselves, their small pension stretched thin by rising costs. "Times are hard, Alara," his mother had said, her voice stiff with unspoken disapproval. "Everyone's feeling it." There was no safety net, no easy answer, only the echoing silence after each hung-up receiver. She even tried calling Mrs. Henderson, a woman she sometimes cleaned for, hoping for an extra shift, a few more dollars. But Mrs. Henderson herself was cutting back, her voice sharp with complaint about the rising cost of everything, the milk, the gas. "It's just criminal, Alara." The phone felt heavy in her hand, each dial tone, each click of the receiver, a confirmation of their isolation, of the world shrinking around them. Desperate, Alara gathered a few small items, things that held more memory than monetary value. A ceramic figurine her aunt had given her years ago, a delicate shepherdess with a chipped crook. A silver-plated picture frame, slightly tarnished, that had once held a laughing photo of her and Michael. A small, intricately engraved locket she hadn't worn in years, a gift from her mother, its chain tangled. She placed them carefully in a grocery bag, the thin plastic rustling, the weight of their insignificance pressing down on her as she walked to the small antique shop downtown. The bell above the door chiming a cheerful, almost mocking tune that felt utterly out of place with her mood. The air inside was thick with the scent of dust and aged wood. The owner, a sweet-faced woman named Clara with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners, looked at the items with a sympathetic frown. "Oh, Alara, dear," she said softly, her voice gentle, "these aren't worth much. Maybe a few dollars for the locket, it's pretty, but the market for trinkets, it's just not there right now. People are buying necessities, not luxuries. Everyone's tightening their belts." Alara nodded, her throat tight, the words lodged painfully. She left with the bag feeling heavier than ever, the few crumpled dollars Clara offered for the locket a paltry sum that wouldn't even cover Lily's next dose of medicine, let alone the rising gas bill. The wind howled that afternoon, a mournful dirge that rattled the windows in their frames, shaking the glass as if trying to tear its way inside. The furnace, which had been struggling all week with a wheezing, inconsistent cough of its own, finally sputtered and died with a metallic groan, leaving an ominous, chilling silence in its wake. The sudden drop in temperature was palpable, an instant invasion of the cold. A thin layer of frost began to form on the inside of the window panes, delicate, fern-like patterns spreading across the glass, beautiful and terrifying. Lily, wrapped in every blanket they owned, A pile of faded wool and worn cotton shivered uncontrollably, her small body trembling despite the layers. Her cough, once a persistent nuisance, was now a painful rasp, tearing at her tiny chest. Her cheeks were flushed with fever, her eyes glassy and unfocused, darting restlessly beneath heavy lids. Alara felt a primal fear surge through her, raw and visceral, a cold hand gripping her heart. This wasn't just about hardship anymore, it was about survival. Her daughter's life, a precious, fragile thing, was slipping away, and she felt utterly powerless. She looked at her left hand again, the simple gold band glinting dully in the weak lamplight. It had been her mother's, a cherished heirloom, then passed to her on her wedding day, slid onto her finger by Michael, whose eyes had been full of adoration and boundless hope. It was a tangible link to love, to family, to a future that now seemed impossibly distant, a cruel mirage. But it was also gold. Pure, solid gold, something of undeniable value. She closed her eyes, picturing Michael's face on their wedding day, his boyish grin, the way his hand had trembled slightly as he placed the ring on her finger, full of hope and promise. The memory was a sharp, exquisite pain, a vivid contrast to their present despair. This was a betrayal of that promise, wasn't it? A desecration of their vows, a public admission of failure. Or was it the ultimate act of keeping it, of fighting for their family, for their child, when all other avenues were closed? The questions tore at her, pulling her in opposing directions, each answer equally agonizing. With a deep, shuddering breath that felt like a sob caught in her chest, Alara made her decision. Her hand trembled as she reached for the ring, her fingers cold against the warm metal. Slowly, deliberately, she slid the ring off her finger. The skin beneath it, usually covered, felt pale and vulnerable, strangely sensitive, as if a part of her had been excised, a small, intimate amputation. A hollow ache bloomed in its place. She found a small piece of faded velvet, a relic from an old jewelry box that had once held pearls, and wrapped the ring in it, cushioning its symbolic weight. She tucked it deep into her coat pocket, the small bundle heavy and solid against her hip. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of shame and determination, each beat a painful echo of her sacrifice. The walk to Goldberg's pawn shop felt endless, each step a battle against the biting wind that whipped her hair across her face and the crushing weight of her secret. The shop was on the edge of town, a squat, brick building with grimy windows, its faded red brick stained with years of exhaust. The neon sign above the door, meant to spell Goldberg's, flickered erratically, missing the D and the R, casting a stuttering, sickly glow onto the slushy pavement. The bell above the door jangled a mournful, tinny sound as she pushed it open, the cold air rushing in behind her. The air inside was thick, a cloying mix of stale cigarettes, old metal, and the unmistakable scent of desperation, clinging to the worn carpets and dusty display cases. Mr. Goldberg, a man with a perpetually skeptical expression etched onto his face and thick spectacles perched precariously on his nose, looked up from behind the counter. He was hunched over a ledger, his bald head gleaming under the single bare bulb hanging overhead. His eyes, sharp and assessing, took in her threadbare coat, her pale, drawn face, the way her hands were clenched in her pockets. "Afternoon," he grunted, his voice gravelly, a sound like stones tumbling. He didn't smile. "What can I do for you?" Alara's voice was barely a whisper, a thin, reedy sound that felt alien in the stuffy silence of the shop. She pulled the velvet pouch from her pocket, her hand trembling slightly, and placed it on the worn, scarred counter. The fabric seemed to absorb the dim light. I need to sell this," she managed, her gaze fixed on a chipped porcelain doll in a dusty display case, anything but his face. Mr. Goldberg picked up the ring, his calloused fingers, surprisingly nimble, turning it over. He squinted at the faint inscription inside, too small for Alara to read from her side of the counter, then held it up to the dim light, examining it with a jeweler's loupe he produced from his waistcoat pocket. He grunted again, a noncommittal sound that gave nothing away. "Plain gold band. Good weight. Not much of a market for jewelry these days, everyone's selling, no one's buying. Times are tough. He named a price. A figure that felt both too low for the immense sacrifice it represented and impossibly high for the current state of her finances. A sum that would make a difference, but not solve everything. Alara felt a wave of nausea, a sudden dizzying rush. It was barely enough to cover the gas bill and a week's worth of proper, nourishing food. Is that the best you can do?" she asked, her voice cracking, betraying the raw desperation she tried to hide. He looked at her, and for a fleeting moment, something akin to pity flickered in his sharp eyes, quickly masked by his usual gruffness, a tightening of his thin lips. "It's a fair price, lady. Better than most places would give you right now. Supply and demand." Alara swallowed hard, her eyes blurring with unshed tears, her throat aching. She nodded, unable to speak, the words caught somewhere between her heart and her tongue. He pushed a few crumpled bills across the counter, their edges soft and worn from countless transactions. As she picked them up, her fingers brushing against his, the gold band slid with a soft click into a small, felt-lined drawer beneath the counter, disappearing from sight. The finality of the action was a physical blow, a sharp, cold shock. Her finger felt naked, cold, an aching void where the ring had been, a phantom weight. The small wad of cash felt like a hot coal in her palm, heavy with the weight of her love and loss, a searing reminder of what she had traded. She walked out of the pawn shop, the bell jangling its mournful tune behind her, the wind feeling even colder now, as if it could sense the emptiness on her hand, the raw vulnerability of her exposed skin. But the money in her pocket was real, a tangible warmth against her thigh, a concrete answer to their immediate crisis. Her steps, though still heavy, felt a little surer. She walked directly to the hardware store, its brightly lit interior a stark contrast to Goldberg's. She bought a small bag of coal, enough to get the furnace running again for a few days, the rough burlap scratching against her coat. Then, to the grocery store, pushing a squeaky cart through the brightly lit aisles. Fresh milk, rich and creamy, eggs, a small cut of beef, oranges for Lily, bright, vibrant bursts of color in the dull gray of their lives. Medicine from the pharmacy, a small brown bottle with Lily's name on the label. Each item felt like a triumph, a small victory against the encroaching darkness, a small piece of their future reclaimed. Back home, the house slowly began to warm, the chill gradually receding. The furnace rumbled to life, a comforting, familiar sound, pushing hot air through the vents, chasing away the pervasive cold. Lily, wrapped in fresh, soft blankets Alara had pulled from the back of the linen closet, ate a small bowl of chicken broth Alara had made, her eyes a little brighter, a faint color returning to her cheeks. She even managed a weak smile. Alara watched her, a fragile relief washing over her, a wave of exhaustion threatening to pull her under. But beneath it, a deep, hollow ache persisted, a raw, exposed nerve where the ring had been. The ring was gone, and Michael, how would she tell him? Or could she keep it a secret, bury it deep beneath the surface of their lives? She made an excuse, a hasty lie that felt brittle even as she uttered it. "My ring," she'd said that evening, trying to sound casual, gesturing vaguely at her bare finger. "I had to take it to the jeweler's. The setting was loose, and it needed a good cleaning. Didn't want to lose it." Michael, distracted by his own failures and the constant, soul-crushing search for work, barely noticed. He just nodded, his mind elsewhere, consumed by his own silent battles, his gaze distant. "Right," he mumbled, his eyes already returning to the classified section of the newspaper. The lie settled between them, a tangible, suffocating presence, a new, invisible barrier. Alara felt it every time she looked at her bare finger, every time Michael glanced, however fleetingly, at her hand. The tension in the house, already stretched taut by their financial woes, now had a new, unspoken layer, a wound that festered beneath the surface of their everyday lives, poisoning the air they breathed. A few days later, a small ray of hope, unexpected and fragile, pierced the gloom. Alara's friend, Brenda, who cleaned houses for the wealthier families on the other side of town, called on their old black rotary phone. "Listen, Alara," Brenda's voice was hushed, almost conspiratorial. "Mrs. Davies, you know, the one with the big house on Elm Street? She needs someone to help with her big holiday party prep. Just for a few hours, a couple of days this week. It's not much, but it's something. You interested?" Alara seized the opportunity, her heart leaping with a mix of gratitude and desperate relief. Any chance to earn an honest dollar, to lessen the crushing burden on Michael, and most importantly, to keep her secret buried deeper, was a godsend. The work was hard, her hands raw from scrubbing and polishing silver until it gleamed, from lifting heavy platters and arranging delicate canapes. But the small, crisp envelope of cash at the end of each shift was a lifeline, a tangible affirmation that she was fighting, that they might just make it. Meanwhile, Michael's despair deepened, a dark cloud settling over him. He came home each evening, his face etched with exhaustion and defeat, his eyes haunted by the rejections that piled up like autumn leaves. He'd open the mailbox, his shoulders already slumped, only to find another polite letter, another door slammed in his face. He started spending more time at O'Malley's pub, the dim, smoky interior a temporary refuge. He'd nurse a single beer, watching the flickering television in the corner, trying to drown out the gnawing feeling of inadequacy that consumed him. He'd come home later and later, the faint smell of stale beer and desperation clinging to his clothes. One evening, he stumbled in, his movements heavy, his eyes bloodshot, and confronted Alara as she sat mending Lily's worn nightgown by the weak lamplight. "We're going to lose everything, aren't we?" he said, his voice raw, stripped bare of its usual quiet strength. He sank onto the sofa, burying his face in his hands. "The house, everything. I can't do anything right." The blizzard eventually relented, leaving Harmony a pristine, silent landscape of white, glittering under a pale, hesitant sun. The air, though still frigid enough to bite at exposed skin, held a different quality now, a crispness that hinted at the eventual return of spring, a promise whispered on the wind. Sounds carried further in the hushed quiet, the distant scrape of shovels, the low hum of a snowplow, the sharp crackle of a neighbor's wood stove. Michael had indeed landed the temporary construction job, grueling work clearing snow from the old bridge and making emergency repairs to its frost-heaved timbers. It was honest labor, back-breaking and relentless, but it brought in a steady, albeit small, paycheck, enough to keep the furnace fed and the pantry from emptying entirely. He came home each evening utterly exhausted, his hands raw and chapped, stained with grease and grime, his shoulders aching with a deep, bone-weary fatigue. Yet, there was a new light in his eyes, a flicker of his old self returning, a quiet resolve that hadn't been there before. The crushing weight on his shoulders hadn't vanished, not entirely, but it had shifted, become something he could carry, something he was actively fighting against, rather than being buried beneath. He spoke little of his day, often just grunting a reply to Alara's gentle questions, but the fact that he was doing something, contributing, seemed to mend a part of him that had been broken. Lily's cough had finally subsided. With regular meals, even if simple, and a consistently warm house, her color had returned, and the fragile light in her eyes had brightened. She was beginning to laugh again, her bright, innocent giggles echoing through the small house like tiny bells, a balm to Alara's soul. The immediate crisis had passed, a terrifying storm weathered, but the scars remained, etched not only in their memories but in the quiet corners of their lives. For Alara, the most prominent one was the bare finger on her left hand. She still found herself subconsciously reaching for the familiar weight, the cool, smooth band of gold, only to be met with emptiness, a phantom sensation that pricked at her heart. The lie about the jeweler still hung in the air between her and Michael, a thin, invisible veil, a silence she had built to protect him, and which now felt like a barrier between them. She knew it couldn't last, not forever, but the thought of tearing it down filled her with a fresh wave of dread. One evening, a few weeks into Michael's temporary work, as Alara was washing the dinner dishes, the warm, soapy water a small comfort against her chapped hands, Michael came up behind her. He circled her waist with his arms, pulling her gently back against him, his chin resting lightly on her shoulder. He pressed a gentle kiss to her temple, a gesture of quiet affection that made her heart ache with both love and the burden of her secret. "You know," he murmured, his voice soft, almost a whisper against her ear, "I went by the jeweler's today, on my way home. Just thought I'd see if your ring was ready. You know, since it's been a while." He paused, his breath warm on her skin. "They said they didn't have anything of yours." Alara froze, the dish rag slipping from her grasp with a soft splash into the soapy water. The sound seemed deafening in the sudden quiet of the kitchen. The moment she had dreaded, the one she had both yearned for and feared with equal measure, had finally arrived. She turned slowly in his embrace, the movement stiff, her eyes meeting his. His gaze was not accusatory, not sharp with anger or betrayal, but filled instead with a profound, aching understanding that seemed to see right through her, past the lies, past the fear, straight to the desperate heart of it all. He knew. He had known, perhaps, for a while, or had pieced it together from her evasiveness, from the way she'd flinched whenever he mentioned it. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden, blurring his face. "Michael," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion, raw and broken. "I had to. Lily was so sick. The heat was off. We had no food. I didn't know what else to do." The words tumbled out, a torrent of confession, shame, and raw desperation, each one an admission of her failure, yet also of her fierce, protective love. She told him about the pawn shop, the shame of walking through its grimy doors, about Mr. Goldberg's indifferent eyes, about the cold walk back home with an even colder feeling of emptiness where her ring had been. She spoke of the fear, the gnawing, relentless fear that had driven her to such a desperate act, a fear for their daughter, for their survival. He listened, his grip on her tightening, pulling her closer until her back pressed against his chest, his chin still resting on the top of her head. He didn't interrupt, didn't make a sound, just held her, absorbing every painful word. When she finished, the silence stretched, heavy with the weight of her sacrifice and his own unspoken guilt, the unspoken knowledge that he hadn't been able to prevent it. He lifted her left hand, gently, carefully, and his thumb slowly, tenderly, traced the bare skin where the ring had been. "Alara," he said, his voice husky, thick with emotion, "my God. You did that for us. For Lily. For me." He pulled her even closer, burying his face in her hair, the scent of her familiar comfort. His shoulders trembled slightly beneath her hand. "I'm so sorry. I should have done more. I let you carry that all by yourself." It wasn't an apology for the ring itself, not directly, but for the crushing circumstances that had forced her hand, for his inability to prevent it, for the quiet despair that had driven her to such a sacrifice. It was a moment of profound vulnerability, a raw opening of wounds that had festered in silence for too long, a shared pain that finally found its voice. They stood there for a long time, holding each other in the quiet kitchen, the warm scent of dish soap mingling with the faint smell of Michael's work clothes, the unspoken truths finally laid bare, not as accusations, but as shared burdens. The ring was gone, a tangible symbol of a promise made, of a past life they had almost lost. But in its place was a new understanding, a deeper bond forged in the crucible of their struggle, a love that had proven itself stronger than any hardship. The winter of 1979 would forever be etched in their memory, a harsh reminder of how close they had come to breaking. But they hadn't broken. They had bent, they had sacrificed, and they had, against all odds, endured. The construction job would end soon, the bridge repairs completed, but Michael was already looking for more stable work, his spirit renewed with a quiet determination he hadn't possessed in months. Alara continued to take on odd cleaning jobs for Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Davies, her hands still calloused and sore, but her heart a little lighter, the heavy secret finally lifted. One quiet afternoon, a few weeks later, with the last stubborn patches of snow melting into muddy puddles and the first brave crocuses pushing through the thawed earth, Lily was playing on the living room floor. She hummed a tuneless song to her worn teddy bear, her laughter echoing through the small house as she stacked colorful wooden blocks. Michael sat on the sofa, reading the local newspaper, the pages rustling softly, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips as he occasionally glanced at his daughter. Alara sat beside him, mending one of Lily's sweaters, the needle glinting in the pale afternoon light filtering through the window. He reached for her hand, slowly, deliberately, intertwining their fingers, his touch gentle and sure. His thumb gently, almost reverently, stroked the bare skin of her ring finger, a silent acknowledgement, a tender caress. There was no need for words. The ring had been a beautiful symbol of a promise made, but their survival, their renewed connection, the way they still found each other's eyes across a room and understood, was a testament to a promise kept, a love that had proven itself stronger than any hardship, deeper than any sacrifice. Spring was still a distant whisper on the wind, a tentative promise in the budding branches, but in their small house, a fragile, hard-won hope had begun to bloom, quiet and enduring. If this story left any impression on you, or reminded you of a moment from your own life, feel free to share it in the comments. Even a small memory is enough. Stories from the past often carry meaning we only begin to understand much later. Your memory might become part of someone else's story.